I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch network. The United States House of Representatives has just passed a very important bill. It's called the Speak Out Act, and it would help survivors of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace from being silenced by non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement agreements that they're forced to sign when they decide to work for an employer. And this bans the practices of NDAs and non-disparagement agreements pre-dispute. I'll talk a little bit about what that means pre-dispute because the law is a bit vague on that, and I wish it was actually a little bit clearer. But nonetheless, the law is an important step in the right direction to stop victims of sexual assault and harassment from being silenced with non-disparagement and NDAs. Now, in the vote before the House of Representatives, 315 people approved the bill, 109 members voted against it, and it shouldn't shock you, those 109 members of Congress who voted against it were all Republicans. So about 52% of all Republicans voted against this bill. Now, this bill will go and be signed by Biden in the next week or so. It was previously passed by the Senate back in September. But I just want you to reflect on that for a second, that 52% of Republicans opposed this bill, which would try to protect victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace from being silenced by non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement agreements pre-disputes with their employers. Now, would it surprise you who the members of Congress are who were leading the charge, the Republican members of Congress leading the charge to try to block this legislation and who opposed this legislation? Well, it's people like Republican Jim Jordan and Republican Thomas Massie. Let's first play the clip of Jim Jordan saying, while he'd love to help out victims of sexual assault, and while he thinks that this legislation may be helpful, he goes, but I also think, but, here, play this clip.
Sexual misconduct is terrible and it's wrong. Those who engage in it should be held accountable. But this bill, while well-intentioned, is misguided. For starters, it's a massive federal overreach. It regulates contract law that has been and should be handled at the state level.
Okay, now here's a clip of Thomas Massie, Republican member of Congress, Thomas Massie.
This is a difficult bill to debate. It sounds good. And I believe the intentions of the other side of the aisle are good as well. Nobody should be subjected to sexual harassment. But there's a problem. We are legislating outside of our domain. We are violating states' rights in doing this.
Okay, in addition to just being completely disgusting that they're voting against this piece of important legislation that everybody should support, their arguments are just so completely disingenuous. They go, oh, it's just a states' rights issue, that it's just the purview of states to focus on passing legislation to stop silencing victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment. This isn't the purview of the federal government. What are you talking about? The federal government absolutely has an interest in passing legislation to improve working conditions across the country, and as part of that, trying to stop the practice of silencing victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace. Like these Republicans are they're in favor of forcing victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment to be silenced in the workplace through NDAs and non-disparagement agreements that they're forced to sign as stipulations of their employment, because that's all the bill says. The bill still permits non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement agreements once a lawsuit is initiated, because that would clearly constitute a dispute. What the definition of a dispute is left vague in the bill, but clearly what this would prohibit is the practice of putting NDAs and non-disparagements in the initial employment documents and employee handbooks, which happens across the country and is a very, very frequent practice, an unfortunate practice that took place before this bill is passed. Now, the fact that Jim Jordan is involved in this seems to be like the ultimate conflict of interest, because as you may know, before becoming a member of Congress, Jim Jordan was an assistant wrestling coach at the Ohio State University, and he worked as an assistant wrestling coach from 1987 to 1995. And while he was an assistant wrestling coach, the team doctor for the Ohio State wrestling team was someone by the name of Richard Strauss. Now, Richard Strauss, who took his life in 2005. In 2018, it was reported through an internal investigation that Richard Strauss had molested and sexually assaulted over 177 members of the Ohio State University wrestling team, and a lot of it took place during the tenure when Jim Jordan was the assistant wrestling coach. Now, one of the things that we also learned in 2018 is at least half a dozen victims of Richard Strauss had come forward, and they had said that they had told and raised complaints with Jim Jordan while the molestation was taking place. And they complained and asked Jim Jordan to help out and to intervene. And Jim Jordan not only refused to intervene, but said that he didn't want to get involved and had nothing to do with it, and refused to do anything, and refused to report the sexual assault and harassment that was taking place to the university, and attempted to cover it up. That's what the individuals allege. Jim Jordan, for his part, denies that that takes place, and he claims that it was a plot or a conspiracy by these individuals who were sexually assaulted and harassed and were victims of this Richard Strauss to just say negative things about Jim Jordan, which is utterly absurd and completely offensive. But now Jim Jordan, who has been accused of covering up sexual assault and sexual harassment and molestation at Ohio State University when he was employed there, now as a member of Congress has tried to block the passage of a bill that would silence victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace from reporting that by non-disparagement agreements and non-disclosure agreements. So the person who's accused of covering it up now wants to stop a law that stops cover-ups. Does that surprise you much that that's what Jim Jordan is doing and leading the charge with Republicans? I want to speak briefly about this piece of legislation, though, as well. The legislation is called the Speak Out Act, and so it bans this practice of NDAs and non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement agreements pre-dispute. And the term dispute is not defined in the legislation. So pre-dispute clearly would mean in the initial employment documents, an employer can't put language that would automatically stop you from reporting what takes place or from talking about it. But what it doesn't do is, in the event that there's a lawsuit, one of the terms in a settlement agreement could still require, as part of the settlement agreement, non-disclosure language and non-disparagement language. And this is at a federal level, so different states have different rules about whether or not they will allow non-disparagement or non-disclosure language in settlement agreements. But what this federal legislation is simply saying is pre-dispute. So pre-dispute would definitely mean before litigation. And so once there's litigation, a corporation could implement non-disparagement and non-disclosure style agreements as part of a settlement. But one of the things corporations are going to want to try to do here is try to say a dispute emerges very early. So the moment that there's a complaint, or the moment that even the sexual assault and harassment takes place, could that constitute a dispute where the employer can then request, as part of a resolution, that there be a non-disclosure agreement and non-disparagement agreement that has to be signed as part of the overall resolution. And advocates that want to stop the practice of silencing victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace would say, no, like, if it has to be dispute, if that has to be what the legislation says, a dispute is only when a litigation is filed. But even then, again, this is what this legislation uses the word dispute, but I don't think there should be the practices of non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement agreements generally. I'd love to know what you think about that. But I litigate these cases. I'm licensed in California, and I work with lawyers across the country, though, on cases where I do what's called pro hoc vice, and I could work with lawyers across the country on cases involving employers who engage in sexual harassment and sexual assault. And one of the factors that has always been, that has chilled the speech and has intimidated employees and just people from coming forward are these non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement agreements in the employment agreement, because they're afraid that the corporations are going to sue them, the moment they come out and talk about their experience. And this legislation, though, is a step, an important step in the right direction. And I'm glad that we had 315 members of Congress support this legislation. It will now go to Biden. Biden will sign it into law in the next week or so. But still, the fact that 52% of Republicans oppose this is shocking. Well, it's not shocking. It's disappointing, but it's consistent with what Republicans do. And special credit for this should go to Gretchen Carlson, who was formerly at Fox, and she's been spearheading efforts to not just at the federal level, but at state level as well, trying to stop these practices of NDAs and non-disparagement agreements. So we'll keep you posted on what happens here, but thought it was important to share that with you. I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Hit the subscribe button right now. We're on our way to 1 million subscribers, and consider becoming a patron of the MeidasTouch Network by going to patreon.com/MeidasTouch, patreon.com/MeidasTouch. There's lots of great exclusive content at our Patreon site, but most importantly, you'll help grow this independent platform. We're not funded by any outside investors at all, so we're purely funded by you and your generosity. So no worries if you can't, but if you can, check us out, patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Until next time, I'm Ben Meiselas.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs, It Wasn't Rigged, You're Just a Loser, at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.